All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today at BioStrategy Partners Practical Knowledge Series. My name is Brian Chow. I am the program manager for the Practical Knowledge Series as well as the Germinator that I'll talk about a little bit. So today's topic will be about non-dilutive funding and startup support programs, and I think we put together a very nice panel for you guys with experts in non-dilutive funding as well as state and federal support programs that are in the area as well as surrounding in the Northeast Hub. So just a little bit about what BioStrategy Partners is. We're a nonprofit consortium of academia institutions that help foster innovations by connecting academia labs with industry partners. And we hope to improve the technology transfer of the inventions coming out of academia labs. So like I said before, we run the Practical Knowledge Series, and we also run the Germinator programs. And this is the program that we really try to connect the academia labs with the industry partners so that they can de-risk the early stage technologies and kind of pair up with the investors. And we also have the Keystone Innovation Zone tax credit program, which we have a representative from MVM Associates today that will go in depth about it. Okay. So I just want to say a thank you to our sponsors, Stradley Ronan, CBRE, and MVM Associates, Silverstein Properties, Cantor Fitzgerald, as well as University Place Associates. Okay, and with that said, I just want to introduce Mary Fuchs, who is a business relations advisor at AOIC, and she's very nice to work with, and she is very on top of things, and I'm very excited to see how she moderates this panel. And so before I hand it off to her, I just want to mention that if you have any questions, please submit it in the chat. And if it's relevant to the discussions we're having at the moment, I'll bring it up. If not, we'll leave 10 minutes at the end to answer your questions. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you enjoy this panel. And Mary?
Thanks, Brian, and thanks again to everyone for joining us today and to our great group of panelists. As Brian mentioned, I'm Mary Fuchs. I'm a business relationship advisor for AOIC. AOIC is a medical and scientific communication company that provides content-driven initiatives for life science and nonprofit organizations. And prior to joining AOIC, I worked for about 10 years in economic development, largely focused on helping startups connect with resources. So our topic for today, specifically non-dilutive fundraising approaches are our focus of our discussion today. And that's generally described as funding that a company receives without giving away any equity or ownership in the company. And some examples of that we'll talk about today include grants, tax credits, and other resources that our incredibly knowledgeable panelists will go through. And so on that note, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Christina, do you mind kicking us off with that?
Sure. Just stick with introductions or go through the slides as well?
Just the introductions for now, and then we'll go through the slides. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Christina Pelican. I am the Assistant Director of Innovation at Princeton University. I just started in this position 2 months ago, but I've been doing this kind of work for about 9 years, in particular around ICOR, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So at Princeton, I am managing the new Northeast ICOR Hub, which is a National Science Foundation funded hub for $15 million. And we have 8 universities right now. We're adding more each year. We have a couple already signed on for years 1 and 2. But we serve the whole Northeast. So when you see our map, I'll show you in a few slides, we serve the Northeast region, and that would include the universities who are not part of our 8 institution hub. And so I can talk about ICOR in a little bit, but sticking to my background, I'm also the COO and co-founder of a chemical tech startup. We've raised a little more than $3 million in 3 years and have some revenue coming in. So I've been there, done it with, in the trenches, just like you have. And I'm excited to be here with you all today. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you. Ken, will you do a quick introduction?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mary. I'm Ken Kilgore. I'm currently the Chief Scientific Investment Officer at Beyond Celiac. And Beyond Celiac, again, as the name implies, is focused on treatments, finding cures, treatments for celiac disease. And this is a nonprofit that's actually located in Ambler, Pennsylvania, or at least used to be. We're now virtual, but from a background standpoint, prior to joining Beyond Celiac, I spent 20 years in big pharma, doing a number of different roles, but primarily focused on researching autoimmune diseases. The last few years were a combination of internal and external work, so doing some investing work for Janssen Pharmaceuticals, looking at external opportunities. And then after leaving Janssen a few years ago, I actually spent time as an EIR at Princeton. So it's a pleasure to meet you, Christina, so welcome. But again, just my current role, and we'll go over this in a bit more detail later, is really running the grant program, or helping run the grant program at Beyond Celiac, and then looking at mechanisms that, especially as it pertains to today, to continue funding those academic investigators and in the future biotechs and other startups. So we're expanding out as well into that area. So, and pleasure to be here, and thank you everyone.
Thank you. And Mike?
Thank you, Mary, and thank you all. Excited to participate. I'm Mike McCann. I own MVM Associates. We help companies identify, manage, and sell mostly tax incentives. We do a little bit of grant work, but these are essentially government programs. A lot of them we'll talk about today, focused on startups, biotech, technology, innovative young companies. And I started the company in 1997. We now, in addition to that, do all sorts of tax incentives. You can see my Rocky poster here. We do film tax incentives, energy incentives, real estate incentives, but particular focus on small, young startup tech companies we'll talk about today. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think up first on our slides, Christina, would you talk more about the resources available? I know you mentioned them a little bit in your intro, that are available from government programs, SBIRs, STTRs, and specifically ICOR.
Sure. Let's see, can I advance? How do I, here we go. How do I advance the slides? You'd think we know.
You should have, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, I'm gonna go one more. I'm pressing the arrow. I'm not sure.
Oh, there it goes.
Is that you, Brian, doing that? Okay.
Yeah,
maybe
that was me. You should have access. But
yeah, I hit the control button, but when I click it, nothing's happening. So, oh, nope, I guess it is. Okay. All right, so let's start with the overview of what ICOR is. ICOR stands for Innovation Corps. It was founded by the National Science Foundation about 11 years ago. The kind of a person who came up with the methodology that we use, his name is Steve Blank, and he teaches or taught a course at Stanford. And the federal government at that point knew that they needed a stronger pipeline filler for the SBIR STTR program, which I'll talk about in a little bit. That is a small business grant for STEM researchers or STEM small businesses, really. And they were seeing a lack of conversion from their basic research grant funding to going into the SBIR portfolio. So they said, what can we do to bridge that gap? And they created this ICOR program based on Steve Blank's course. And so we've been running this program for 11 years. A couple years ago, a number of additional federal agencies, I want to say maybe 8 others, adopted the ICOR program, and it's now written into law with Congress. So it is something that is kind of the gold standard of testing the commercial potential of really early stage technology, especially coming out of universities. So the course is focused on interviewing customers to identify unmet needs and jobs and workflows, and if there is any problem to be solved that the technology could fill. So that's really what we teach in the ICOR program. At our hub, we run 2 types of programs. One is called a regional program, and that is, again, just for our Northeast region. It consists of 4 sessions that are 3 hours long right now. So like I said, we just launched a little more than a month ago. So this is what the program looks like right now. It might iterate in future months. We're a startup as well. So right now it is 4 sessions, 3 hours each. And we have the first 3 cohorts set. We are starting our first cohort in a week and a half. And we have 14 teams from a number of universities in that first cohort. So I'll talk about eligibility maybe in the Q&A, but just know that if you're on this call, you're more than likely eligible if you have some kind of STEM innovation. It does provide a $3,000 grant from NSF, and then you are then eligible to go on to the national, what's called the TEAMS program, capital T. That is a separate grant that the NSF provides to you if you're accepted. It's a $50,000 grant, and you have to go through the 7-week training program as part of that grant. And so I've been teaching that level of I-Core at the national level for 9 years. And before coming to Princeton, I was running, or at least managing and teaching the site, the I-Core site at University of Delaware, which is another part of the hub now. So this is kind of the training that we provide as of right now. There might be more short courses, even before the regional I-Core program. We might do something like an accelerator that happens after the national I-Core program. But right now, these are the 2 flavors that we offer. And there are, I'm going to say there's 4 hubs, and then in the Mid-Atlantic, New York City, Midwest area, and then the Bay Area. And there are a number of, I think there's like 9 nodes, but some of them overlap with the hubs. So there are a number of universities involved in the I-Core program at this point. Was that me or you, Brian? Either that or we're like really synced up on timing. Okay, so this is the network I was just describing of the different hubs that exist. So if you happen to be in New York State and you're maybe a better fit for the New York City hub, we can introduce you to them. This is our region in particular. It's a little grainy because it's just a zoomed in version of that map. But Princeton is the lead of our Northeast hub, and we have a number of other universities here. But like I said, we serve the whole Northeast. So it's not just these institutions. And the benefits to going through the program, in addition to the money, right? That's always usually the initial attraction. It really is a life-changing opportunity for those who have not gone through any kind of market readiness program. So it gives you skills that you'll need to assess if the innovation has commercial potential, and those skills are translatable to any number of innovations that you have or will have in the future. It also allows you to grow your network because, again, you're interviewing customers. So you're basically creating your own proprietary market research report from all of the data that you're collecting by talking to people out in the industry. We also provide a number of mentors and instructors to you as a hub. And so you kind of build your network through those experienced entrepreneurs and innovators. The team, you do have to have at least 2 members. They can be grad student, faculty, postdoc, to some degree undergrads, but again, it has to be a deep technology that's been developed at a university. And you do have to commit to going to the training program that we offer. So there's some more info there. And then I wanted to kind of talk about, I'll end here with how does this fit together with the SBIR program. So let's say you have invented something great and you don't know quite what the potential of it could be, but you want to figure that out. So you come to our regional I-Core program. We provide you that 4-session training program, the $3,000 grant. You go through that, and then you go on to the national NSF I-Core Teams program. You get the $50,000 from NSF. You go through their 7-week training program, and you say, okay, I think there's something here. I want to start the startup. You form the LLC or a C Corp, whatever it is. And then you go on to an SBIR STTR Phase 1. The SBIR program stands for Small Business Innovation Research, and it's for any small business, which is defined by the SBA as less than 500 employees. So you don't have to only be, a university spin out to go for an SBIR grant. But going through the I-Core program makes you much more competitive for the SBIR Phase 1 in particular, because you have a better sense of your broader impact of the technology. So your proposals are just much stronger. And the numbers here are outdated, actually. A couple months ago, the NSF changed the SBIR Phase 1 to 275,000. So there's a couple other opportunities on the pathway here that you could consider, but I think those are the 3 most important ones: the regional I-Core program, the national I-Core program, and then the SBIR grant. All of those are non-dilutive, meaning they're free money from the federal government paid for by tax dollars. You don't have to give up any equity. to receive that funding. So that's all I have as far as slides. I can talk more maybe in the Q&A, but I can turn it over to I think it was Ken that's going next.
Yep. And I got to thank you so much. For today, a couple of things that I'd like to talk about. One is really in the sort of my time when I was at Janssen Pharmaceuticals. Approximately, this all started probably a decade ago. I think because of the last 2 years, time has lost all meaning. But certainly, this was occurring in the early 2010s. This program, the Germinator Program. So I want to go over that. And really, it was, I think, a fantastic example of a group of people getting together, discussing some options, and forming a program that has continued to move forward. I guess I'll be talking about more of the historical perspective on it, but certainly continues to move forward at BioStrategy Partners today. So that'll be the first thing to talk about, which is the Germinator Program. And then I want to follow that up with discussing our at Beyond Celiac, our granting program that we have in place, and go over, this is a program that's actually very new. We've been doing grants for a number of years, but the way that we're doing it is definitely focused on really taking ideas coming from the academic community and then moving those forward into, I think, a well-defined path for treatments, a cure, diagnostics, or whatnot. So in essence, we're really looking at applying the knowledge coming out of the academic environment and really steering that towards a productive, if you will, treatment paradigm or whatnot. So and now I'm going to struggle with the same thing. Brian, can you advance this? Yeah, there we go. Again, just real quick to talk about the Germinator Program. And as I mentioned, this started around 2011, 2010 or whatnot while I was at Janssen. While I was there, I was starting to focus on the external environment and really coming up with ways to, how do we tap the outside world as far as targets or technologies or whatnot, while at the same time offering support to the academic community and really enabling research to go forward in a directed fashion that can benefit everyone involved. We started this, and the way the partnership was designed was BioStrategy Partners was taking the administrative roles. That is, one of the key features here was not to have a 50-page application program. So we just went with a call for proposals at Janssen, few things that we were interested in. BioStrategy Partners would put out that call, and really it was just a very short paragraph, if you will, from the academics to figure out, if their technology applied to what we were interested in or whatnot. So just to stress, the real desire at this point was really to keep the paperwork down. The way that the program was funded was actually, again, BioStrategy Partners would handle the administrative. The industry partner, in this particular case, Janssen at the time, would put in half of the funding, and these were about $60,000 grants. And the university members themselves would be putting in half the funding at the time. That varies now, but it was a program that was designed so everyone was putting skin in the game, and everyone had a vested interest in succeeding. And I think the real advantage of this approach was not just the funding, because it wasn't meant to be staggering amounts at the time, but the real advantage here, the real I think key features were that it did enable a cross discussion between the academic environment and the industry partner. These were teams. These weren't just writing checks and hoping for the best, but these were teams that really had depth coming from both institutions, and the experience that came from both institutions actually ended up driving the program forward. And this was key for Janssen in a number of different areas, in that it allowed us to get an idea of what the collaboration would look like in the future if we were interested in moving forward and putting in larger sums. In essence, it was a valuable I guess I don't want to use the word test drive per se, but it was a valuable, interaction just to see how that would go from a collaboration standpoint. Certainly, we tried from the industry, we tried to provide access to our technologies as well. So at times we would have investigators from the universities coming over to Janssen, making that experience with availability to the technology that we had in-house, et cetera. And this program went on for till I left, certainly, and resulted in a number of different things. One is we took in a number of assets, number of tech platforms, if you will, into Janssen itself. And so we had the right to, the only thing we put in place at Janssen was the right to continue funding. That is, if we wanted to provide more grant money, we would be able to do that if there was interest. But we certainly had the wherewithal to drive these projects forward. A number of the programs were actually brought in-house. Other programs that, if Janssen didn't have an interest going forward, were spun out into their into companies themselves. And so we were able to form newcos from that standpoint, which benefited hopefully everyone. And it was really a fantastic exercise in de-risking many of the features associated with an industry academic collaboration. Besides de-risking the compounds themselves or whatnot, it helped de-risk the partnership, the interactions there. And it was in my career, I think, one of the most valuable and most enjoyable programs that I was involved with. And it was a fantastic way to support the local community, certainly, from where I sat. So this was the Germinator program, which again continues, and I would encourage anyone who has interest in this to look at the BioStrategy Partners website to gain more information about this, as far as the industry partners that are now part of the program, as well as the university members. But I think it was a novel approach and certainly a successful approach. Now, and we can go to the next slide, Brian, if you can do that. So after leaving Janssen and the Germinator program behind, so to speak, as I mentioned at the introductions, I did go to Beyond Celiac. And one of the real changes there, as I mentioned briefly, but just to expand on that a little bit, was that we had a number of grants that we would be putting out each year, but we needed to, what I felt, really take a more strategic approach from our granting program, and that's what we did. Is we went through the scientific objectives, we set some real focus on that, and that's what we have here on the left-hand side, is really looking at the evidence generation. Any grants that we would fund had to have applicability to, one of these. So evidence generation, translational research, enabling clinical trials, and drug repositioning. The last, just to touch on that, is one thing about celiac is it's considered the gateway autoimmune disease, and it's the only autoimmune disease with a known antigen, and many are feeling now that in the industry that this could be the best disease to work on in the autoimmune space, because we have the tools in place, we know the antigen, and we can help any data that gets generated from celiac disease will help other autoimmune diseases as we learn to as we seek to further the understanding of celiac. But we put together this granting program, and I call it a strategic granting program, because it really did focus on taking these proposals and making sure that they had applicability in the long run to generating treatments, cures, or diagnostics or whatnot. So this is really the formation of our strategic granting program. We also did a couple of things differently besides this, which was we are very interested in what I call crossover pathologies. So we want to not just limit our grants to celiac disease per se. And one of the other autoimmune diseases are fair game as well, as for reasons I just mentioned. And actually one of the grants that we're funding now that I think it will be groundbreaking is actually a group out of Oxford in the UK that was for HIV people originally and converted over to looking at celiac disease. But it really does it really does point out the value of being open on some of these grants that we make, and that they just don't have to have the word celiac in it to be applicable here. So we certainly have opened it up to include other diseases, whether it be diabetes or MS or whatnot. So this is part of our flexible program that we have in place, which is we're looking for investigators that have the core scientific abilities to study autoimmune diseases and then have that applicability to celiac disease at maybe a later time. As I mentioned before, with the Germinator program, we are very big on partnerships. So it's not just a matter of writing a check and hoping for the best. We want to be able to certainly not get in the way, but if investigators need advice or whatnot, we have a whole plethora of tools available to us in-house, as well as the experience around celiac disease. And then finally, a key feature of this strategic granting program is that we want to be able to not just fund the initial work that goes into it, but we want to develop tools, and this is ongoing, develop tools that enable us to continue making either grants or non-dilutive approaches, or coming up with other tools to take maybe equity stakes in companies as they're formed. So we're looking at again on investigators that have the ability to go forward to provide additional grants, not a one and done per se. We do want to have the ability to leverage our partnerships. We have a number of external partners, whether it be pharma, biotechs, venture capital. We want to be able to make those connections as well and to make those introductions. So if we do have a high probability project that could develop a therapy or whatnot, we want to be able to help to make those introductions so that the new co that gets formed or whatnot has the ability to continue going forward. And then finally, and I do have this one in italicized, which is we are looking at and developing mechanisms to continue to invest, maybe shifting away from a grant sort of structure into a more equity stake, into new commercial opportunities. And so what we want to be able to do is be positioned to help investigators in the early stages as they form the ideas that will eventually make up a new co, but then also as that new co gets put in place, be able to make investments into that company. So this is a bit of a translational step. It's still ongoing, certainly, but I think it really does represent a continuum of what we're trying to do in our interactions with the academic community or new co's or whatnot. So I will leave it at that. I appreciate the time, certainly. And again, happy to answer questions as we get into the last few minutes to open that up.
Great, thank you, Ken. Mike, you are very knowledgeable in another type of non-dilutive funding that startups may utilize, and that's state and federal tax credits. Can you explain more about how those work for the startups? Thanks.
Yes, I can. Thank you, Mary, and thank you all again for allowing me to participate. So if we go to the next slide, Brian. So real quick, a tax credit, unlike, let's say, a tax deduction, a tax credit is a credit that you can use directly to offset your tax liability to zero or reduce it, as opposed to, say, a tax deduction that will lower your amount of taxable income, which could lower your tax liability. But the question becomes, well, how is that applicable to us, right? We're small startups. We're investing all our money back into our companies. We don't have a tax liability, right? So that the state of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, I'll talk more about Pennsylvania today, they realized that back in the early 2000s, so they started allowing companies to transfer or sell those credits so that they could get value for them, so that a young biotech startup or a young medical device or a young chemical startup could take the money from that and invest it back into their company. So these are credits that you can sell. They're non-dilutive as the other programs we just discussed, meaning you don't have to give up any equity in order to obtain them. Next slide, please. So what can you use these, and we'll get into the exact credits, but you can basically, in Pennsylvania, you can use them for whatever you want. You can invest them back into your business. You can hire people. There's no limitations on what you can use it for. There's only the requirements, new requirements, that you do need to report what you did use it for, but there's no restrictions. So it gives you great flexibility as a business owner to be able to utilize these for what you want. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Pennsylvania. I don't want to go into other states because we don't have a lot of time. What I would encourage you, if you're in New Jersey or Delaware or elsewhere throughout the United States and watching us today, is go to the Economic Development Agency for your state. You know, for example, in New Jersey, it's NJEDA. I think in Delaware, it's DIDO. And you can see what programs they have. But we're going to talk about Pennsylvania today. So for young tech-related companies, there's two programs, the KIZ and the R&D program. So how do you qualify for KIZ tax credits? So they're available, as it says, for tech, biotech, life sciences, manufacturers. If you're developing a product, if you have a proprietary product or solution, you can qualify this if you're less than 8 years old and you're located within a Keystone Innovation Zone. And the credit is equal to 50% of your year-over-year increase in revenues up to $100,000. So, you know, this program, if you're 8 years old, so you can qualify for it years 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So you can get $100,000 in tax credits each year that you can invest into your company if you qualify for this. Next slide, please. So where do you have to be? I'm going to go. There's 26 KIZs throughout the state, but the BioLaunch 611, which BioStrategy's partners runs that KIZ. You can see it's a very large swath of land. That western border there is basically all of Route 202 from Doylestown down to King of Prussia, comes back across Montgomery County along what turns into Girard Avenue in the city of Philadelphia, comes all the way back over to 95 and then all the way up. So, you know, the Discovery Labs facility is in there, Springhouse Innovation Park, certainly Dr. Block's facilities in there, and obviously Temple University. So this is a gigantic area that if your business is located in there, you're in the Keystone Innovation Zone. So if you're less than 8 years old and you're within those technology components, you can qualify for the credit. Next slide, please. So University City, this is actually an old map. So you can see there's the big swath around the University City area, but the eastern end now goes all the way down to Front Street and then actually goes up from 5th to Front to about Vine Street. So again, this is a big area where you could locate your company or you may be located there. The Navy Yard is also a KIZ. So now, how do you qualify for it? Again, it's 50% of your year-over-year increase in revenues. You might say, well, we're a young company. We don't have any revenues. Correct. But perhaps, as we just went over before, you got an SBIR grant or an STTR grant or one of the other grants. Grant revenues count as revenues. So you could have $0 you start up this year or last year in 2021. You have a $200,000 grant you draw down on in 2022. 50% of that difference is $100,000. And what's that $100,000 worth when it's sold? It's worth about $90,000. So this is a very, you know, significant amount of money for a young startup that they can have of non-dilutive capital. Next slide, please.
Mike, before we go on, I received a question.
Yep.
So he said that KIZ is revenue based. If you're a startup developing a new product like his company, they have no revenue and they have been told that they do not qualify. Is there any way that we could help them out, or do you have any advice for this person?
Sure. Well, if they're saying, first off, I would encourage anyone looking at this to contact who is the KIZ coordinator. For the Bio 611, it's Erica Swift with our group here, and then with the University City, it's Alafia Simmons, to discuss with them their company, what their product is, how they qualify, and the KIZ coordinators will help them. And we could help them too, but they should first go to the coordinators. So that would be my recommendation to see, you know, and then as far as the revenues go, if they have no revenues in a particular year, you still want to qualify so that the next year when you do have revenues, you can then qualify for the credit. So the other credit here in Pennsylvania, research and development. So again, if you're a young startup, this credit allows you to qualify for what you're investing to create your product. And it's a little complicated, but let's boil it down to an easy math. It's basically 20% of your increase from year to year in investment. So if you had a very limited investment in your product in this year, next year you invested, you know, $200,000 in my example before. The difference between those two, it's So you're talking about a $40,000 credit that you could qualify for that, like the KIZ credit, you could sell for cash to reinvest in your company. In order to qualify for the research and development credit, you have to have qualified research expenditures. That's defined by the federal rules. So if you can qualify for a federal research and development tax credit and you're doing it within Pennsylvania, you can qualify for this credit. So next slide, please. So as I said, the federal credit, which the state of Pennsylvania credit is based on, is also a credit that companies should be investigating if you're creating a product. Reason being, you're already spending the money, so you can qualify this. At the federal level, you don't have to apply for it like you do in Pennsylvania. You can simply take it on your tax return. There's a form for qualified research expenditures, and it's approximately 7 to 10% of what you spent in any given year. And the value of it is, while you may not have a tax liability to use it against, if you're a startup company within 5 years, you can use that credit towards the employer's portion of your Social Security taxes. So as you grow and you're adding employees over the years, you can actually get a refund or a credit against that. So, it's almost like a grant coming back to you for this expenditure. So those, as long as you're investing in the United States, it qualifies for R&D. And then again, if it's within Pennsylvania, you can qualify for the Pennsylvania tax credit. Important thing here with R&D, both at the state and federal level, is if it is grant funded, you cannot count that towards the credit. That's basically double dipping. You're already receiving government money from the grant. You can't also then say, well, this was my expenditure for the R&D credit. It's one or the other. So this would be money. Perhaps you have an angel investment, some money that your friends and family have put in, or venture money that's actual money that you're spending of your own, not grant money. Okay, next slide, please.
Again, before we move on, there's another question or comment. So this person has been told that IP costs and contractor costs do not qualify for R&D tax credits. So could you clarify on what actually qualifies for the R&D tax credits, and if you could help this person out?
So the answer to that question is they may. It's a little technical to get into. What I'd rather do is I'd rather kind of correspond with that person directly, see what those expenditures were, and then I can have a specialist look at them and say, yes, this could qualify or not. So, but I mean, it's generally the cost that you're investing to develop the product. There are some exclusions, as the questionnaire said, but it depends on the specifics. So. And I think that's what we have. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mike. So I do have a few questions for the panel, but I also encourage anyone to continue to send your questions to Brian. And Brian, please jump in anytime you see any of those. So timing-wise, when should entrepreneurs start working on these different types of funding? Mike, I'll start with you since you were talking about the tax credits and timing already.
Yeah, so this is actually really important. So for the KIZ and the R&D program, and again, if you're in other states, those programs as well, you want to really start looking at these very early on in the business, because most of them require you to submit information about when you started with the company. For example, the KIZ program, you're going to need the lease. You're going to need your startup incorporation papers to show that you're less than 8 years old, your lease to prove that you're in the KIZ. With research and development, as people are asking questions about, and I think it's contractor costs and IP costs. So there you need to document the expenditures and really have them looked at from the beginning, because you need to support them later on if they're questioned or if there's an audit. So the answer would be, really early on, you want to start at least the initial steps of documenting the qualified expenditures or qualification related items, as I mentioned before. Certainly within the first year of the company, you want to do it. So.
Thanks. So right at company formation, start keeping track of documents.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's no one's really ever does it that way, but I would say soon after that, you want to start, because you'd hate to miss out later and be like, oh, you didn't do that in the first year, and therefore you've missed an entire year's worth of these benefits. So.
Great, thank you. Christina, how about ICOR? When should a company start looking at applying?
Sure. I would encourage you to think about it even before you start the company. If you have a company on paper, then that's fine. But I-Corps should really be done as a very first step coming out of the lab, right? So you think you have something there, you think you might have a business model, you think somebody might care about the technology or might buy it. It's time to go test that. So this is, the very first thing you do in the entrepreneurial journey before you're even an entrepreneur, right? You're still a researcher, scientist, engineer when you're going through I-Corps. So I encourage teams to think about it as soon as possible. And if you have to put something tactical around it, then what I would suggest a team does first is to disclose their invention to their tech transfer office and then come apply for I-Corps right after that, or even maybe during your disclosure process. And then, if you figure out your claims through the I-Corps process, you can move on to a provisional from there and or start the company or just license the IP. So it is a really early stage program. The regional and the national should be done as soon as possible.
Great, thank you. And Ken, so I have two questions for you, one related to the Germinator and when a researcher should apply there.
But I think what we're seeing in the questions that were just asked, right, is we have sort of a gradient of tools available to us, and starting from, I guess I would consider tapping into programs like Germinator is really early. And what I mean by that, or the reason for that, is that programs like Germinator, and I'll even throw in what we have at Beyond Celiac from a granting standpoint, or any nonprofit, I think that expands across the board there. The earlier the better, because one of the things that we try to do, especially in Germinator and now in Beyond Celiac, is to provide direction or a critical path. That's a term that's probably overused, but with an investigator, let's sit down early while this is an academic project, but moving forward, and define that critical path. What are the key questions that have to be answered that's going to enable IP to be generated or a new code to be formed or whatnot, and then define that path and move forward. So, the bottom line answer to the question is really as early as possible, because it's that direction, it's that critical path that's really going to enable things to move forward in a straightforward, famous last words, but straightforward manner. And it does help accelerate things and not waste time on maybe questions that don't pertain to a new co-formation or whatnot. So I think both types of questions are great, but if you're looking to really form a new co, then I would say sit down with your partners or people that you can work with and define that critical path earlier rather than later.
And so what's the best way for a company to reach out?
Okay. In terms of Germinator or whatnot, or
both?
I think it really applies to both. It's the way that we do it in Beyond Celiac is just simply drop an email to myself.
Great.
I really do stress that we talk with a lot of companies. Again, the mission here for us is to cure this disease, develop treatments for the disease. And so we'll talk with investigators to help out and provide input. It doesn't have to be associated to a grant. It doesn't have to be, a special friends and family program or anything. It's simply, we want to help cure this disease. And part of that job is to really sit down with people and just talk and provide guidance where we can. And so I would encourage anyone who's, believe they have something for celiac or autoimmune diseases to just drop myself an email and I'll be happy to sit down and chat with them. It's something that I enjoy and the members of Beyond Celiac certainly enjoy as well, the science team. And then from the BioStrategy partner standpoint with Germinator is I think we'd have to provide the correct contact for that now. But the website would provide the information that we need, I believe so.
And I think that might be Brian.
Yeah.
So thank you. Brian included the contact information here for all of the panelists, and I think, Brian, maybe could you put yours in the chat as well from a Germinator standpoint? That would be great.
Yeah, I can do that.
Thank you. So we've talked, today more about the non-dilutive funding. So I want to just take a few minutes before we really wrap up to talk about realistically how much money a company can expect to receive through some of these various sources. Is it enough for them to sustain the research or to sustain their company? Christine, I'm going to start with you. You shared a funding support pathway slide that included both ICOR and SBIR. If I added correctly, and even with the increase in some of the federal grant funds, it's roughly 1.3 million for a company. So what's the time frame around that? And is every company eligible for that total amount?
Right. So the time frame, we'll start there, is it can be as fast or as slow as you want to move. But here's what I would suggest. If you were very entrepreneurial and you were very fast paced and you were really trying to get things off the ground, you go through our second cohort of the regional ICOR program, which launches in, I think, early April, second week of April. That's 4 weeks. So then in May, you apply for the National ICOR program. You go through that in the summer and get $50,000 from NSF. And then once you've completed that at the end of the summer, you apply for your SBIR phase 1 with NSF, or you could go for a Partnership for Innovation grant, which is another NSF grant that's pre-company formation as well. So if you still need to kind of build out the technology a little bit and you're not quite ready to form the company and go for an SBIR, then a PFI would be a better next grant. And that is also a $250,000 grant. So, or rather it's 250. So SBIR is 275 now. So let's say you go for an SBIR and you submit your project pitch. It takes 2 weeks to get you the turnaround time on if you're accepted or not. You submit your proposal via Fastlane. That takes roughly 4 months, kind of at best right now because of COVID. It takes 4 to 6 months to find out if you've received the SBIR, another couple more months to go through due diligence and get the funding. So let's just call it 6 to 9 months from that point, which is a little bit long for startups, but unfortunately, there's a lot of throughput that NSF has for the SBIR, so it does take a little bit of time. So you're probably looking at about a year from when you started the regional ICOR program if you're successful in getting your SBIR phase 1. And then maybe you go through an accelerator, bring in either equity-based or dilutive funding. Maybe you go through or maybe you go for the Science Center QED if you're a healthcare. There's other regional, there's a lot more regional and local funding sources that are out there. Delaware has the EDGE grant, which is $100,000. And so that in a year you can easily get to, or at least if you're eager, you could easily get to close to 300,000, I would say. Which is what we did at Lignolix. And then after that, the SBIR phase 2, you probably want to wait another 6 months or more before you apply for that. If you get an SBIR phase 1 and you want to go through ICOR again, you can apply for a $20,000 supplement to go through an SBIR only ICOR program. So there's an extra $20K there to grab. So that's kind of the pathway. The SBIR phase 2 at NSF is around $1 million. So you really do have to kind of figure out a lot of your business model to be successful there.
And
there was a second part?
Eligibility wise.
Sure. So for ICOR, it's different than SBIR. ICOR has to have a connection from the technology needs to be connected to the university. So even if you are employed at or a student of a university, that does not automatically make you qualified for ICOR. You have to have developed the technology at the university. There may or may not be IP around intellectual property around the idea, the technology. But if there is, it should be university-owned IP because you built it at the university. So that's the first and foremost thing. Anything other than that is what we call a community team, and we are looking at building resources and programming for community entrepreneurs. But at this point, NSF has the mandate we can only bring in, teams who have developed something at a university to ICOR, and that applies for regional and national. For SBIR, it's any small business that has something that is high risk, high reward. And the NSF has recently updated their the branding of the SBIR program to be called America's Seed Fund. So they do view themselves as your first investment, so to speak, but it's, again, non-dilutive. They're your first investor. They're taking, big risks because it's taxpayer dollars. They're not looking for an immediate ROI. They can be a little bit more patient with those dollars versus a VC or angel could not. So that's kind of the eligibility there. And then as far as like being competitive, that's a whole other conversation.
That's a whole other session for another
Right.
day. Thank you. Ken, from Beyond Celiac, what grant-wise, funding-wise are you looking at for companies? Just maybe a range.
This is something that we are currently developing, the grants, as far as, and there's, the reason that we're developing this approach, if you will, whereby, we'll put in X amount of money, and it's probably going to be, it'd probably be something around that just 100,000 or whatnot range initially. But again, it's looking to help get that start from a non-dilutive standpoint. But it's a program that we're interested in putting together because there are a lot of, I think, really good solid technologies that can be applied, or platforms that can be applied to celiac, and we want to help enable at all steps. And so this is why what we're talking about with our discussions as far as funding new co's in a non-dilutive sense is fairly early in those discussions. But part of it is we now have at least one company that we're interested in talking with and helping build that together. So it's part of the discussion on how we would go with that and how we would position it. But we're just finding there's a lot of, I think, very interesting things out there, and we're trying to develop that, trying to fill in that gap between a grant and that initial equity investment, and that's where this fits in. I can't give a real firm number yet because it's sort of
ballpark is great.
Exactly.
That was helpful.
Yeah, so
Thank you.
in that 100,000 or what, whatnot. But again, it's to be a short-term solution. And
great.
Short-term funding.
Thank you. And Mike, with the tax credits, when a company sells their tax credits, realistically, what will they get on their return, and how long does that take?
Sure, great question. So very straightforward on the first one. The credits will generally sell for about 90 cents on the dollar. So, if you have a $100,000 credit, you should be looking to get around $90,000 for it, just to use, and then you can just use that same math for smaller credits or larger ones if you're lucky enough. As far as the receipt and how long it takes, that's important to know with these programs. Even though they are for startups, it takes a while to get the money. So if you remember how it works, you have a base year, and then you have a secondary year where you compare it against with both the KIZ and R&D program. Those applications aren't due until the third year, and then it's sold the fourth year. So you're really not getting the money till 4 years in. Though once you do qualify, as I said, for the KIZ program, you could be getting it for that year 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And the R&D, there's never any cap on, because as long as you're increasing your investment, you could qualify for it. And at the federal level, you can just get it based on what you're spending that's eligible. So it is important to know that these are great programs, but they're not coming quickly. And the dollar amounts, just by doing the math, the maximum you're going to get for a KIZ credit in any 1 year is worth about $90,000 to you. In the research and development, if it's 20% roughly of what your increase from 1 year to the next is, you'd have to be spending a pretty significant amount. So for startups, you're generally going to see R&D credits in the 10,000, 20,000, 15, 25, in that range in a year unless there's a year where they have a really significant increase in spend. So they're great programs. You want to take advantage of them, but just know it's going to take that long to get to them.
Great. Thank you. Well, I know we are coming close on our time, so I'm just going to ask our panelists if they have any closing comments. Mike?
Yeah, I encourage you to get in touch with the Erica Swift, or if you're in the center city with Alafia Simmons about the KIZ program. If you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them, but they're the front end. Maybe it's Brian now, right? I guess who would answer the questions about the KIZ program. And then also, if you're not in Pennsylvania, as I said, look at your state economic development agency and look at the programs that they offer.
Great, thank you. Christina?
Sure. So we have done a couple of info sessions already about the I-Corps program. I'm going to put in the chat the link to those videos. So if anyone is interested in learning more about I-Corps or SBIR, you can contact me, but please start by watching the video there because it will answer a lot of questions. And I'm happy to work with anyone who's interested in applying to I-Corps. We were really looking to bring in anyone and everyone who's eligible to go through our program. So get in contact.
Great, thank you. Ken?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you everyone for being here today. And I think I would just summarize by saying that in general, the nonprofit route for grants and for non-dilutive funding, I think is, no matter what the disease, if there's a nonprofit, that's a fantastic route to talk to, whether it be for funding or general information. As far as where I sit at Beyond Celiac, again, we are really open to defining new ways of doing things. And so I would welcome the opportunity to chat and see what we can come up with. There's, as I mentioned, flexibility is key here. And so those discussions are valuable for everyone involved. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Ken and Christina and Mike, for being part of the panel today, and to Brian for hosting us, and to everyone who joined in today. And so, Brian, I'm going to turn it back to you.
All right. Like Mary said, I want to thank everybody for joining in on this practical knowledge series. I also want to thank the panelists for taking the time to be on this panel, and Mary for the excellent moderator. I also, so I'm going to advance to this slide. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me. So for the KIZ, Erica Swift, the president of BioStrategy Partners, is in charge of that. But if you reach out to me, I'll definitely connect you with Erica. And we're very happy to help out in any way possible. And so I again want to thank the sponsors for hosting an event, and a little bit of a plug in here. Next month, Practical Knowledge series will be about the current trends in digital health. So if you're interested in that space, feel free to get in contact, and I'll add you to the registration list. So again, thank you everybody for joining, and we hope that you learned something here that can help grow your company. So thank you everybody.
Thank you.